The first sign that June Ellison was starving was not a cry, it was the question she stopped asking. Every evening the 7-year-old used to ask when supper would be ready. On the 4th day without a real meal, she said nothing. She no longer stared at the empty shelf. She no longer asked when the stove would be warm again. She simply sat beneath the porch roof with her cheek against Mara's chest, too tired to complain. On the high plains of New Mexico territory, silence could mean peace, or it could mean a child had learned there was no use asking. Mara tightened both arms around her. "Just a little longer," she whispered. June's eyes opened halfway. "Are we leaving Papa's place?" Mara looked across the 160 acres Eli Ellison had broken with his own hands. The fence leaned. The windmill stood still. The well rope hung loose over a shaft that had gone dry in a single night. "No," Mara said. "We're staying." June swallowed. "Will Papa find us here?" 74 days had passed since Eli rode toward Dry Creek and never came back. The county deputy called it an accident. Mara never believed him. Eli knew every wash, every sinkhole, and every patch of bad ground between their ranch and the county line. 3 nights before he vanished, he had stood beside the well with mud on his boots and fear in his face. "The plains lie," he told her. "They look empty on top, but there's always something moving underneath." Then he gripped her shoulders. "If this well fails, don't sign anything. Water does not disappear in one night." At the time, Mara thought hunger and grief had made those words feel larger than they were. Now the well was dry, and men from town had already come twice with papers they wanted her to sign. Mara lifted her head. A lone rider was crossing the field from the west. He wore a dust-gray coat, a battered hat, and the tired posture of a man who had spent half his life in a saddle. A flour sack was tied behind him. So was a rolled blanket and a long rifle in a leather scabbard. He slowed at the gate. His eyes moved from the dead windmill to the empty woodpile, to June's narrow face. He dismounted. "Mom," he said, "when did that child last eat?" Mara stood, keeping June behind her. "We're managing." The stranger's attention moved from the warped roof to the dry trough. "No," he said quietly, "you're being erased." Mara's hand moved toward the small revolver beneath her shawl. The man noticed, but he did not reach for his own weapon. Instead, he untied the flour sack and placed it on the ground. Inside were beans, salt pork, coffee, dried apples, and enough flour to fill the empty shelf. "I can't pay you," Mara said. "I didn't ask. I don't know you. That is reason enough to be careful." He stepped back from the food. "My name is Caleb Shaw. I run cattle 7 miles north of here." Mara studied him. "What brought you here?" Caleb looked at the well. "Because Eli Ellison asked me to." June's fingers tightened around her mother's dress. Mara's voice went cold. "You knew my husband? I knew what he found. Then where is he?" Caleb did not answer. Not yet. By evening, a thin column of smoke was climbing from the chimney again. June ate slowly at first, as though she no longer trusted food to stay in front of her. Then she finished one bowl and looked at the pot. Mara nearly wept when the girl asked for more. Outside, Caleb walked the property instead of eating. He crouched beside the well. He examined the windmill gears. Then he pulled a strip of rawhide from the pump housing. Someone had sliced it cleanly with a knife. The pump had not failed. It had been made to fail. He found 2 more signs before dark. The north fence had been cut from the inside. A wagon had stopped behind the smokehouse, where the ground was hidden from the road, and on one cedar post, 3 diagonal notches had been carved into the wood. Caleb touched them with his thumb. His face hardened. Mara had followed him. "What does that mark mean?" "It means Silas Mercer has decided this land belongs to him." Mercer owned nearly 12,000 head of cattle and most of the men who wore badges in San Miguel County. In 8 months, 6 homestead families along the Red Mesa Draw had lost their wells. Each family had signed the same relinquishment paper. Each ranch had been bought for almost nothing, and every one of those abandoned claims sat along the route of a proposed railroad loading spur. Mara stared at Caleb. Ellie knew. He knew the wells were being sabotaged. He knew Mercer's survey crew had moved federal boundary stakes, and he knew the only spring-fed draw for 20 miles ran beneath this property. A faint sound came from the ridge. Horse tack. Caleb looked up. 3 riders stood against the last orange light, watching. They were waiting for hunger to finish what fear could not, he said. The riders did not come down that night. They wanted Mara to see them. They wanted her to imagine what would happen when they did. Caleb slept in the barn doorway with his rifle across his knees. Mara did not sleep at all. Just before dawn, she found him beside the smokehouse, prying up a flat stone with the edge of a shovel. Beneath it lay a narrow brass tube sealed with wax. Mara recognized the red thread tied around it. Eli had used that thread to mend June's winter coat. Caleb opened the tube. Inside were copied land records, hand-drawn maps, and 6 signed statements from families who had lost their claims. One page showed the original federal survey line. Another showed where Mercer's men had moved it by almost half a mile. The final sheet carried Eli's handwriting. "If I do not return, the proof is not where they will look first." Mara read the line twice. "What does that mean?" Caleb looked toward the dry well. "I was hoping you knew." A rifle cracked from the ridge. The shovel jumped out of Caleb's hand. June screamed from the porch. 3 riders came down the slope at a trot. The man in front wore a deputy's star, Harlan Dobbs, the same deputy who had signed Eli's accident report. He stopped outside the gate and smiled as though arriving for Sunday dinner. "Morning, Mrs. Ellison." Mara stepped in front of June. Dobbs held up a folded document. "Mr. Mercer is offering $40 for the claim, plus a wagon ride to town. More generous than the land is worth in its present condition." Caleb lifted his rifle. Dobbs's smile disappeared. "You were told to north of the draw, Shaw, and you were told a badge does not make theft lawful." The 2 men behind Dobbs spread apart. One moved toward the barn, the other toward the well. Dobbs looked at Mara. "Your husband made this harder than it had to be." The sentence hit her harder than the gunshot. "What did you do to him?" Dobbs's eyes flicked toward Caleb. That was answer enough. Caleb fired first, not at a man but at the ground in front of Dobbs's horse. The animal reared. The yard erupted. Mara dragged June behind the stone water trough. Bullets punched through the porch rail. Caleb moved along the fence, firing only when one of the riders exposed himself. He was not trying to win a gunfight. He was trying to keep them away from the house. Then a 4th rider appeared from the south, Silas Mercer himself. He wore black broadcloth despite the dust, with a silver watch chain across his vest and gloves too clean for ranch work. Behind him came a buckboard carrying 2 more armed men. Mercer surveyed the yard as if inspecting livestock. "Enough," he called. The shooting stopped. Caleb had blood running from his left shoulder. Mara held June so tightly the child could barely breathe. Mercer dismounted and walked to the porch. "I do not enjoy frightening women," he said. Mara looked at the bullet holes in her house. "No, you enjoy making fear look official." Mercer's smile thinned. He placed the relinquishment paper on the porch table. "Sign this and the child eats in town tonight. And if I don't," he glanced at Dobbs, "by sunrise the county will declare the claim abandoned." Caleb laughed once bitterly. "You cannot declare it abandoned while she is standing on it." Mercer turned. "That is a temporary problem." His men rushed Caleb before he could raise the rifle. One struck his wounded shoulder. Another drove him to his knees. Dobbs seized the brass tube. Mercer opened it and examined the papers. For the first time, worry crossed his face. Then he saw the word copied at the bottom of each page. The worry vanished. He fed the papers into the kitchen stove 1 sheet at a time. Mara lunged forward. Dobbs caught her by the arms. The maps curled black in the fire. The 6 statements became ash, and Eli's handwriting disappeared last. Mercer leaned close to Mara. "Your husband carried originals too." Her breath stopped. "He carried them all the way to Dry Creek." Caleb looked up. Mercer continued almost casually. "He had several chances to tell me where the last survey marker was. He chose not to." Mara heard June begin to cry. Not loudly, that was worse. "Did you kill him?" Mara asked. Mercer adjusted one glove. "I gave him the same choice I am giving you." Something inside Mara went still. For 74 days she had lived between hope and grief. Mercer had just burned away the hope, but he had also made one mistake. He believed grief would leave nothing underneath it. He pushed a pen toward her. "Sign." Mara looked at the dry well, then at Eli's final line. "The proof is not where they will look first." She remembered the night he came home with clay under his nails. She remembered him lowering a lantern into the well, even though the bucket had already come up full. She remembered him telling June that the first stone ring was older than the ranch, and she remembered his warning. Water does not disappear in one night. Mara picked up the pen. Mercer relaxed, then she snapped it in half. "If you want this land," she said, "you will have to steal it in front of everyone." Mercer's face changed. He nodded to Dobbs. "Burn the barn." One of the men kicked over a lantern in the hay. Flames climbed the wall. Caleb drove his head into the chin of the man holding him. Mara grabbed June and ran for the well. Dobbs fired. The bullet struck the windmill brace above her, showering them with rust. At the well curb, Mara shoved the bucket aside and reached beneath the first ring of stone. Her fingers found a gap packed with clay. Inside was a small iron box. She pulled it free just as Dobbs reached her. He raised his revolver. Caleb fired from the ground. Dobbs spun and fell into the dust. Mara opened the box. Inside lay the original Federal Survey map, the brass cap from the missing boundary stake, Mercer's private payment ledger, and a folded statement bearing Eli's signature and the seal of the Territorial Land Office. Not copies, proof. Mercer stared at the ledger, then at the smoke rising from the barn, and beyond the smoke riders appeared. Not 3, more than 20. They came from every direction along the draw. The Hales, whose well had failed in November, the Navarro brothers driven off their grazing claim in January, the widow Beecham and her 2 grown sons, families Mercer had scattered one by one. Caleb had spent 3 weeks finding them. Before riding to Mara's ranch, he had sent word that if smoke rose from the Ellison place, Mercer was making his final move. At the center of the group rode a gray-haired man wearing a federal marshal's badge. Beside him was a clerk from the Territorial Land Office carrying a locked document case. Mercer reached for his gun. Mara raised the ledger. "Go ahead," she said. "Make the last page match the rest." Every witness in the yard saw him hesitate. That hesitation ended him. The marshal dismounted. Silas Mercer was arrested for land fraud, witness intimidation, arson, and the murder of Eli Ellison. Harlan Dobbs survived his wound long enough to trade testimony for a prison sentence. The moved survey stakes were restored. 5 stolen claims were returned to their families. The 6th family had already gone east, so the territory paid them from the sale of Mercer's seized cattle. Caleb stayed through the spring. He rebuilt the barn wall, he repaired the fence, and when he replaced the sliced rawhide in the pump, water rose after 17 strokes, clear, cold, still moving beneath the ground exactly where Eli said it was. Weeks later, Mara stood on the porch while June ate warm bread with dried apples. The girl finished 1 slice, then she looked up and asked for another. Mara smiled and handed it to her. Silas Mercer had mistaken a dry well for dead land. He never understood what was still moving underneath.